I've been turning this over in my head for weeks now, and I still can't believe what I'm watching unfold. Mark Carney just did something that no allied leader has dared to do in over a year. He stood on a global stage, looked at the cameras, and told Donald Trump, without ever saying his name, that the American-led world order is dead. And then he got a standing ovation. Not polite applause, a standing ovation at Davos. That almost never happens. But here's where it gets fascinating. Instead of backing down when Trump fired back, Carney doubled down, then tripled down. And now, the U.S. House of Representatives just voted to overturn Trump's tariffs on Canada. Republicans crossed the aisle. The president's own party turned on him. This is not how this was supposed to go. Let me walk you through what actually happened, because the mainstream coverage is missing the real story here. On January 20th, Carney took the stage at the World Economic Forum. He had written the speech himself. No speechwriters, no committee draft. And what he delivered was essentially a declaration of independence from American hegemony. "We are in the midst of a rupture," he said. "Not a transition, a rupture." He went on to describe how great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. And then came the line that everyone is now quoting. "Middle powers must act together, because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu." The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace analyzed the speech afterward and called it uncharacteristically candid, both for Davos and a Canadian. They noted that Carney laid out, for all to hear, the catastrophic implications of Washington's current policies for global order, and signaled that at least one erstwhile ally is prepared not only to hedge against an unpredictable and predatory United States, but if need be, to balance against it. Read that again. Balance against. That's diplomatic language for building a counterweight, for treating the United States not as an ally to be accommodated, but as a threat to be managed. And Carney did this from Canada, historically America's closest friend. Is it just me, or does this feel like a turning point nobody saw coming? I'd really like to know what you think. So here's what happened next, and this is where the story gets even more interesting. Trump was scheduled to speak at Davos the following day, and he clearly watched Carney's speech, because when he took that podium, he came out swinging. "Canada lives because of the United States," Trump declared. "They should be grateful to us, Canada. I watched your Prime Minister yesterday. He wasn't so grateful. They should be grateful to us. Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your remarks." But here's the critical detail. Carney wasn't there to hear it. He had already left Davos. He didn't stick around to kiss the ring or smooth things over. He went home to Quebec City and held a cabinet retreat. When asked about Trump's comments, Carney didn't apologize. He didn't clarify. He said publicly, "To be absolutely clear, and I said this to the president, I meant what I said in Davos." That's direct confrontation. That's not what allies typically do with Trump. They usually offer some diplomatic language about working together or shared values. Carney essentially said, "I said what I said. Deal with it." And Trump responded by kicking Canada off his Board of Peace, this new initiative he's forming to resolve global conflicts. The invitation had been extended, and Trump rescinded it with a formal letter on Truth Social. "Dear Prime Minister Carney," he wrote, "please let this letter serve to represent that the Board of Peace is withdrawing its invitation to you regarding Canada's joining what will be the most prestigious board of leaders ever assembled at any time." That's the President of the United States publicly uninviting the Canadian Prime Minister from a diplomatic initiative because Carney refused to back down. But instead of crawling back, Carney went on offense. Within days, he had announced a strategic partnership with China. Canada cut tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% down to 6.1% in exchange for China dropping tariffs on Canadian agricultural exports, canola, lobster, peas, and more. Chinese importers immediately started snapping up Canadian canola cargoes. Trump erupted. He called Carney Governor Carney, the same dismissive nickname he used for Trudeau, and threatened 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods if Canada pursued a trade deal with China. If Governor Carney thinks he is going to make Canada a drop-off port for China to send goods and products into the United States, he is sorely mistaken, Trump posted on Truth Social. China will eat Canada alive, completely devour it, including the destruction of their businesses, social fabric, and general way of life. But here's what Trump missed. Carney was already 3 moves ahead. The China deal wasn't a free trade agreement. It specifically avoided that designation to stay within CUSMA obligations. Carney had threaded the needle. He got the economic benefits without technically violating the trade agreement with the U.S. And while Trump was raging about China, Carney was signing deals elsewhere. 12 trade and security agreements in 6 months across 4 continents: Indonesia, Thailand, India, Ecuador, the UAE, Qatar, and more. He's targeting the Philippines, Saudi Arabia, Mercosur, and ASEAN next. The goal? Double Canada's non-US exports within a decade, reduce American leverage, build what Carney calls strategic autonomy. I think this fundamentally changes how we should think about Canadian foreign policy. Would love to hear your take on whether this strategy can actually work. Now let me explain why this matters beyond just Canada-US relations, because there's a much bigger picture here. What Carney articulated at Davos wasn't just about Canadian trade policy. It was a philosophical framework for how middle powers, countries that aren't superpowers but have significant economic and diplomatic weight, should operate in a world where the rules no longer protect them. He said something that I think will be quoted for decades. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination. That's a reference to Václav Havel, the Czech dissident who became president. Havel wrote about living within the lie under Soviet communism, the way people accepted fictions they knew were false because it was easier than confronting reality. Carney is saying that the fiction of the American-led, rules-based international order, where trade was supposed to be mutually beneficial, where allies protected each other, where institutions like the WTO and UN resolved disputes, that fiction is over. And continuing to pretend otherwise makes smaller countries vulnerable. The multilateral institutions on which middle powers have relied, he said, the WTO, the UN, the COP, the very architecture of collective problem-solving, are under threat. His solution? Build coalitions. Not naive multilateralism, but what he calls principled pragmatism, working issue by issue with partners who share enough common ground to act together. And here's where it gets really interesting. This isn't just theory. Carney has already started implementing it. In September 2025, he launched the Buy Canadian policy, requiring federal contracts over $25 million to prioritize Canadian suppliers, Canadian content, Canadian materials. Every Crown corporation, every federal funding stream, every major procurement now has domestic requirements attached. He established a $5 billion strategic response fund to help industries affected by tariffs diversify and grow. He created a $5 billion trade diversification corridor fund to upgrade ports, railroads, and highways, the infrastructure needed to redirect trade away from the United States. The auto industry is getting $3 billion to adapt. The canola producers are getting biofuel incentives. There's workforce training for 66,000 displaced workers. This is industrial policy on a scale Canada hasn't seen since the national policy of the 1870s. The government is essentially saying, we cannot rely on our most important trade relationship as we once did. We must build our strength at home. But it goes beyond economics. Carney has been explicit that Canada is rethinking even defense relationships. He's been meeting with European leaders about critical minerals partnerships, NORAD modernization, Arctic defense. Canada and Australia signed a radar deal. Sweden is contributing to Ukraine aid programs alongside Canada. The question isn't whether Canada is diversifying. The question is whether it can do so fast enough to matter. And that brings me to the development that made this whole conflict escalate to a new level. On Wednesday, February 11th, the U.S. House of Representatives voted 219 to 211 to terminate Trump's tariffs on Canada. 6 Republicans crossed the aisle: Thomas Massie of Kentucky, Kevin Kiley of California, Don Bacon of Nebraska, Dan Newhouse of Washington, Jeff Hurd of Colorado, and Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania. Only 1 Democrat voted no. This is the first time the Republican-controlled House has directly confronted Trump on a signature policy since he took office. And Trump immediately threatened political retribution. Any Republican, in the House or the Senate, that votes against tariffs will seriously suffer the consequences come election time, and that includes primaries, he posted while the vote was still underway. But they voted anyway. Representative Don Bacon, who's retiring rather than seeking re-election, said something remarkable on the House floor. Why doesn't the Congress stand on its own 2 feet and say that we're an independent branch? We should defend our authorities. I hope the Supreme Court does, but if we don't do it, shame on us. Now, to be clear, this vote is largely symbolic. Even if it passes the Senate, Trump will almost certainly veto it. But the symbolism matters enormously. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said afterward, "Congress has spoken with bipartisan clarity. It's time to give Americans relief and end Trump's tariff tax. This price-spiking tariff tax is raising costs on everything from grocery prices to energy bills, all because Trump chose chaos over common sense." The Senate has already voted twice to block Trump's tariffs on Canada, with 4 Republicans joining Democrats: Mitch McConnell, Rand Paul, Susan Collins, and Lisa Murkowski. What we're witnessing is a fracture, not just between the U.S. and Canada, but within the Republican coalition itself. Trump's tariff policy has become politically toxic in districts that depend on Canadian trade, and there are a lot of those districts. Canada is the top export destination for 36 U.S. states. Nearly $2.7 billion worth of goods and services crosses the border every day. About 60% of U.S. crude oil imports come from Canada, 85% of U.S. electricity imports. Canada is the largest foreign supplier of steel, aluminum, and uranium to the U.S. When Trump imposes tariffs on Canada, he's not just hurting Canadian companies, he's hurting American factories, American workers, American consumers. And members of Congress are starting to hear about it. Ontario Premier Doug Ford called the House vote an important victory with more work ahead, and thanked lawmakers from both parties who stood up in support of free trade and economic growth between our 2 great countries. But here's the question nobody can answer yet. What happens next? Carney has positioned Canada for a prolonged economic conflict with the United States. He's building coalitions with other middle powers. He's diversifying trade. He's investing in domestic capacity. But the numbers are still daunting. Close to 70% of Canadian exports still go to the United States. The geographic proximity, the integrated supply chains, the infrastructure, all of it still points south. China may be Canada's second largest trading partner, but the relationship comes with its own vulnerabilities. Beijing has shown it's willing to use economic leverage too. It weaponized canola imports against Canada for years before this recent deal. And the European Union, while promising, remains bureaucratically slow. The Canada-EU trade agreement still hasn't been fully ratified by all member states. The real test will be whether Carney can translate diplomatic activism into durable trade flows. Speeches at Davos don't move containers through ports. Investment announcements don't automatically create jobs. Infrastructure takes years to build. Meanwhile, Trump isn't going anywhere. He still has the power to impose tariffs. He can still threaten 100% levies on Canadian goods. He can still weaponize regulatory processes, border inspections, energy exports. And there's another dimension that keeps me up at night. What happens if Carney's strategy inspires other middle powers to do the same thing? Already we're seeing movement. The European Union is pursuing its own trade diversification with Mercosur and India. Japan is rebuilding economic ties across Asia. South Korea is hedging between Washington and Beijing. If middle powers start genuinely coordinating, if they build the coalitions Carney is calling for, then we're looking at a fundamental restructuring of the global economy. That might be good for those countries' sovereignty, but it could also fragment the trading system into competing blocks, increase transaction costs, reduce efficiency, and ultimately make everyone poorer. The optimistic version of this story is that Carney is right. Middle powers can build a more cooperative, resilient world by working together instead of being played against each other by great powers. The pessimistic version is that we're watching the beginning of a new era of deglobalization, trade wars, and economic nationalism, with all the historical echoes that implies. So where does this leave us? Mark Carney has done something extraordinary. He's positioned Canada, a country that historically defines itself as America's best friend, as the leader of a global movement against American economic coercion. He's refusing to back down despite direct attacks from the President of the United States. He's building alternative trade relationships at unprecedented speed. He's investing billions in domestic resilience, and he's making the philosophical case that middle powers need to stop accommodating bullies and start building counterweights. The U.S. House just voted to overturn Trump's tariffs. Republicans broke ranks. The president is threatening primary challenges against his own party members. The cracks are showing. But whether Carney's strategy succeeds, whether Canada can actually reduce its dependence on American markets, whether the middle powers can actually coordinate effectively, whether the global trading system can survive this period of disruption, all of that remains to be seen. What I find myself wondering is this: are we watching a new model for how smaller countries survive in a world of predatory superpowers? Or is Carney overplaying his hand, betting on coalitions that may never materialize, while the economic damage from tariffs continues to mount? I genuinely don't know the answer. But I think this is one of the most consequential geopolitical stories unfolding right now, and almost nobody is covering it with the depth it deserves. What's your read? Is Carney's strategy bold leadership, or is it a dangerous gamble that could backfire spectacularly? I really want to hear what you think on this one.